Honored to have Dr. Chadi Nabhan here. He is an oncologist who testified against Monsanto in the lawsuits related to Roundup. Dr. Nabhan, I want to ask you first to just give people a background on your medical practice, but also how did you get connected to these lawsuits? Why were you asked to testify? And thanks for doing this.
Allison, thank you so much for the invite. I appreciate being with you, first of all, and I appreciate getting the opportunity to chat with you and with your viewers and listeners. So I'm an oncologist and a hematologist. What that means really is I took care of patients with cancer and blood disorders, and I did this for many, many years. I did transition after that. I do more research and administration. But when I was in academic and clinical practice, I did a lot of work in a form of cancer called lymphoma. Lymphoma is a form of cancer that involves the lymph glands, the bone marrow, sometimes, which is the factory that produces the cells we have in our blood, and the immune system. So I guess with time, I did a lot of research on this, clinical trials, and I became known in the academic world as an expert in lymphomas, lymphoid malignancies. There are so many types of lymphomas, by the way. We can get into that later on. But I was, I did not do any expert witness work in the past. It's not, there are physicians who all they do is expert witness work. It wasn't me. This was not what I did. And I would be called to look into cases for malpractice cases, but I was never really intrigued or interested in that. In the spring of 2016, I was contacted by a law firm called the Miller Firm. It's a law firm based in Virginia, and they said that they got my name through people that they've worked with as a lymphoma expert, and they were asking me about Roundup and the relationship between Roundup and lymphoma. And I recall, it's hard to believe, Allison, it's now 7 years plus since that first phone call. But I recall telling them that I've always known that pesticides as a category increase the risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, but I was not really familiar specifically with the data that are related to Roundup. But I said, it's intriguing to me. As they were talking to me, I'm looking on the web about Roundup and glyphosate. And I said, well, I'd like to know more about this. So let me do some research on it and send me what you have. And then we can convene after that. So really, the reason I got that initial phone call is just because I was known as a lymphoma expert who has taken care of lymphoma patients, who have actually published in the field. And there was emerging data that was coming out on the relationship between glyphosate and cancer, specifically non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So the Miller firm was representing some patients who were suing Monsanto at the time, and they got my name and they called me to see if I would help them and help these patients. And I did say I'm willing to research and review the evidence, and I'll get back to you, because I was very intrigued by how commonly Roundup is being used.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really how it all started. But my background is I'm a cancer doctor, took care of patients for many, many years. And it is the most humbling and honorable thing to do is taking care of people who have cancer. I think that health is the most precious thing that we all have. Everything else pales in comparison. We can all agree to that. And when someone who has a health issue trusts you with their health in their most vulnerable time, it is very, very humbling. So it's the best thing I've ever done is taking care of people and patients, and that's really why I also got involved in these lawsuits.
All right, just a shout out to your website. So if people want to find you, because you also host a podcast as well, you're a busy guy. And if you're interested in hearing more from Dr. Nabhan, you can go to chadinabhan.com. When do you do your podcast?
So my podcast airs every Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. Central. It is not live. I tape it and then I air the podcast a few weeks after. It is called Healthcare Unfiltered. It really tackles a lot of healthcare topics, not always cancer, it's basically everything. I mean, as an example, my next episode coming out, I took this week off, but my next episode coming out on July 11 is going to be with the chief medical officer of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, talking about drug shortages, chemotherapy shortages, and things of that nature. So I have another podcast episode coming out on the opioid crisis and how one of the physicians who was actually ended up going to jail because of that and his experience, and then he got released, and there was lots of issues that he was, he was really innocent, and he never really got a chance to describe what happened, but he wrote a book on it. So I interview him, and so I have general healthcare topics, but it's every Tuesday morning.
Okay, very interesting. Let's go back to Roundup. So you were kind of new to there being a discussion around connecting cancer to this. Well, it's technically an herbicide, if I understand correctly, right?
Right.
So what did you find that convinced you enough to then become a witness?
So the first thing, just so you know, that as a lymphoma physician, most lymphoma physicians, the majority of lymphoma physicians know that pesticides as hazard compounds increase the risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. We've always learned this. I don't recall who taught me this, but if you ask 10 lymphoma specialists, 9 of them will say pesticides increase the risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. But
Do you know
there are so
why?
many types, right? Well, that's a very good question. It's not really clear why. And there are so many types of pesticides, right? I mean, there's so many types, and there's herbicides, insecticides, and other things going on. But we always knew 2 things. Pesticides increase the risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and farmers have higher risk of developing non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So I knew that, but I did not know the details of Roundup. So when I was called, I researched Roundup, and what intrigued me is how commonly it is used. It is the most common used weed killer in the United States of America, if not the world. So that's a lot. And I thought to myself, if indeed there's a link, this could have significant implications on patients who are diagnosed with this type of lymphoma. So I started researching the literature and what we can find actually in the literature about the relationship between Roundup, its ingredient glyphosate, with cancer, and what type of studies that were there, what type of animal studies, what type of mechanistic studies, and the lawyer sent me also some documents to review, and they after I signed some confidentiality agreements, they were able to share some information that were in the discovery and things of that nature. So I spent several months actually researching all of this before I agreed to testify. But to answer your question, and sorry to digress, what type of information I found? I found a lot of animal studies that confirmed the exposure to glyphosate causes tumors and cancers in the animals. I found some mechanistic studies by which glyphosate, which is the main ingredient in Roundup, could damage the cell, the DNA, and could actually cause lots of chromosomal damage and oxidative stress. So these are all mechanisms by which cancer could evolve. And then I found some human studies that linked Roundup to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. There were other human studies that did not. So there were, from a human study standpoint, there were some studies that showed the linkage and others did not. But then you put everything together and you realize you have animal studies, mechanistic studies, and some human study. So that's really what led the WHO and IARC to classify glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. Allison, what that means that in some patients, it could cause cancer. It does not mean that in every patient it causes cancer, but it means that on balance, glyphosate, the main ingredient in Roundup, could be harmful. That's really on balance what it actually means. And I think that is important for us to know.
So just showing everybody here, this is the EPA website, and they say that it's unlikely to be a carcinogen. I'm just trying to find the exact quote here because, of course, Bayer now owns Monsanto. They say the same thing. So I'm just curious. I'll find it while you're talking. What do you think about that? That the EPA and Bayer still hold that it's not carcinogenic.
Well, I can
Oh, here we
understand.
go. EPA found that glyphosate is unlikely to be a human carcinogen, and it says that it's upholding those that's in February 2020.
But remember
That
what
was what it's doing, but it says the same thing now.
remember what happened here. There was an interim decision. If you go to see the, this paragraph on June 17, 2022, the U.S. Court of Appeals
Hmm.
for the Ninth Circuit vacated the human health portion of glyphosate and held that EPA's registration review decision under FIFRA was an action that triggered ESA obligations, and they actually wanted the EPA to actually look at the evidence again and to provide a deadline by October 1, 2022. And the EPA said, well, can you extend the deadline? But the court said, no, you have to actually review your interim decision pertaining to glyphosate. And then what the EPA did, they withdrew their interim decision, so they did not have to really be held accountable for that to re-review the evidence. It's actually very interesting. Here's what I would say. It is not surprising to me that Bayer will maintain that their product is safe. I mean, I don't obviously agree with them, but they're the manufacturer of that product. So, they are going to keep saying this no matter what, despite, Allison, the fact that they have lost the first three major trials. They have paid over $11 billion in settlements to settle over 100,000 cases, and their share price has gone down by over two-thirds. Their market cap went down as a company. And their CEO lost the vote of confidence by the shareholders. And the Wall Street Journal called the acquisition of Bayer to Monsanto. It was reported by Ruth Binder that it's one of the worst acquisitions in business. So there's a lot of things to say that. So, in my opinion, there are so many flags that they're guilty. It doesn't really matter to me whether they admit it or not. It doesn't matter if they win cases or not, and they've won some cases, as you know. But I am disappointed by the EPA's position.
Yeah, because look at this latest news. I mean, this is old, but Bayer welcomes U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's reaffirmation that glyphosate is safe to use, not carcinogenic.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's all over. Every time I go to Home Depot, I'm just shocked that there's that much in stock. But you know what it says to me? That people are still using it. And I think that to me is the disappointing part, is that there's still so many people buying Roundup. But you're saying you're disappointed in the EPA. Why is that?
So two things. Number one, I am disappointed in the EPA because the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency. It is the agency that we are putting our trust in to tell the public hazardous compounds or not. And I respectfully disagree with their decisions. And in the book, Toxic Exposure, I go through the history of the EPA. And you will learn that the EPA at some point, by the way, in the early 80s, determined that glyphosate is possibly carcinogenic. And they were demanding from Monsanto studies to show that it is not. And somehow, several years later, the demand for these studies dropped, and the classification of glyphosate changed without any additional information. So you must pause and think why. And I think it is disappointing that we are not really trying to look critically at the evidence and put public health at the top of priority. To your other point, going to the stores and finding it, it is extremely disappointing. Bayer actually, and you should find it on their website, Bayer has supposedly said in 2023 they're going to pull Roundup from the market for residential use. So if you're going to go to Home Depot and buy it because you want to kill the weeds in your garden, you shouldn't be able to. That only farmers should be able to. Pesticide applicators should be able to. But we are in 2023, and I still find everywhere you go, Home Depot or wherever you want to go, you will find actually Roundup. And part of me is thinking, what did we do? So we won 3 major trials, we won settlements, all of these things as a team, but it's still there, it's still being sold. And I'll tell you why I think that is. I think because as a weed killer, it does work pretty good. I mean, it does kill weeds. And it's been, there are people who are not paid by Monsanto, farmers who just will tell you it's fine, I like it, and I'm not gonna. There's no evidence. And look at the EPA. You know better than the EPA. Who are you?
Mm-hmm.
Who are you to tell me that the EPA is wrong?
Mm-hmm.
So you have several ammunitions. You have people who believe it works, and the EPA tells them it's safe, and they don't. There's no alternative. I mean, these are the trifecta. Now, imagine if there's an alternative that comes into market and an entrepreneur finds an excellent weed killer that does not have these risks. And I think there's a big opportunity there, and consumers will actually find it. But how are you going to reverse years of uh, using a compound that people have said it's safe, you can drink it? Have you heard that? Have you heard people said you can drink it? There are people who have actually said, I mean, they, in people have said it is so safe you can drink it.
I
I'd
think
like,
I have.
I'd like to see Monsanto's executives drinking it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, we have somebody in the chat who says, I'm a landscaper. There are easier ways to take care of pests and weeds. I did want to show this is a thanks for the super chat. Brother Brovet says, challenge, try finding the number of Vietnam vets killed with Agent Orange made by Monsanto and actually several other companies that were directed by the government. The VA has been paying benefits. They have the number. They keep it secret. It's between 300K and 400K. I don't know that for sure, but I do know this as a wife of a veteran. It takes a long time for the government to say, yeah, actually, that may have been a problem, right? I mean, Agent Orange was just only recently, I think, Dr. Nevin, if you know, I believe it was only recently even classified as something that you could get benefits for. I think it took a long time, decades, for Vietnam veterans to receive
Absolutely.
any treatment for that or any kind of disability benefit for that.
Absolutely. And look, here's the deal. We have to agree that science evolves. What I have trouble with is when people don't appreciate the science evolution. Allison, at some point, smoking was considered not unhealthy. Physicians were advertising for tobacco. You can Google, you just go, anybody of your
Yeah.
viewers and listeners, just Google doctors' ads for tobacco, and you are going to find doctors smoking and saying, doctors preferred Camel, the
Hmm.
brand. But that's okay. Maybe 50 years ago, maybe we didn't know. And then with time, we knew. So yes, at some point, maybe we didn't know Roundup and glyphosate and what they cause. And I'm fine with that because we didn't know at some point. But as we progress, as we learn more, to keep our head in the sand and say, no, it is very, very safe and you can drink it and don't worry about it, is just not fair to the public. So
Hmm.
we have to embrace how we continue to know more than before. And that's what I struggle with. There's still no warning label. So you know what that tells you? That you as a citizen, you're being deprived of a choice. That's how I would look at this. You can go in today and buy a pack of cigarette and smoke it all, and you are within your right to do that, but you know the risks, don't you? You have the risk and you're willing to do this, but it's your choice. You know the risks and you're willing to take on risk is an individual thing. But now there's nobody that knows that risk. There are people. There's no warning label. There's nothing that says on Roundup that there are some people who say that this is carcinogenic. No, no warning label. What that means, as a consumer, you are being told that this is safe, and there's no smidge of evidence that it could cause a problem. And there's enough evidence that it could cause a problem in some people. I never said it causes problem in everybody, but it does cause problems in some people. And these people deserve to know the risks. So if they decide to use it, at least you know that there is risk associated with it.
Okay, Shadow Kane. I noticed nobody is talking about the effects of exposure on wildlife or pets, but Dr. Nabhan is a human oncologist. He's not a veterinarian. He's not a farmer, but I will ask you this. And then I got to talk about wine for a quick second. Have you heard of Dr. Zach Bush? Because he was also, I believe, a cancer doctor, and he's gone into this. He has the Farmers Footprint, I think, nonprofit trying to get farmers off of glyphosate because he really thinks that it has an extreme negative effect on the gut microbiome. And I wanted to ask you about that too. Like, do you find there to be a connection with it being an herbicide and then the importance of bacteria to our health, our microbiome, and cancer? I just was curious if I could ask you about that. But hang on before you go into that. Don't forget, everybody. Thank you to Bonner Wine. If you go to AllisonWinePromo.com, you get amazing wines you can't get anywhere else. They're all high altitude, remote regions of Argentina, and you help bring folks like Dr. Nabhan on my podcast, people that a lot of sponsors would not stick with. They probably would stick with him, but there are a lot of other ne'er-do-wells that come on my podcast that they probably would say, you know what, that's just too much. That's too far. So if you want to be an extremist, but you don't want to go to federal prison, these are extremist altitude wines, and you can get any one of them that you like. All of them support my work. You get 50% off the wine itself, 50% off shipping. They make a great gift, and they have a cause. Like I said, these are uncensored wines. A lot of them are unfiltered. They use natural fermentation, hand-picked grapes, and the grapes work very hard for you. They're almost at 9,000 feet, the one in the middle, and the other two are over 6,000 feet. So working very hard for you in very remote regions, and it makes the wine not only taste great, but like I said, it's wine with a cause. So go check them out. If you're a coffee drinker, you can also go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, where you get USDA certified organic, so no Roundup there. Organic roast, there's light roast, there's dark roast, and there's also Katura tea if you're a tea drinker. I drink the espresso every morning with my latte, and it's very good. I highly recommend that. I'm also a tea drinker. I like the Katura tea. It's the tea that you make from the fruit around the coffee bean, and I cold brew mine 24 hours. So go check them out. twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, AllisonWinePromo.com. Okay, so yeah, going back to the farmer question, I'm just curious. You don't have to respond to Zach Bush or anything, but what do you know about that, the microbiome
Yeah.
and the connection to cancer?
Look, I think it's a good question. It's a good question, and I think what your viewers and listeners obviously know is that in the mid '90s, the introduction of the GMO seeds have made a huge difference because it led to more explosion of the use of glyphosate, right? So now you have these seeds that are resistant, the crops are resistant to the effects of glyphosate and Roundup. So farmers are able to spray on everything and it doesn't damage the crops. But what does that actually mean? It means you're spraying Roundup on soy, on corn, on everything. So this obviously leads to more abundance of glyphosate in our diet, bread and other things. So you must start thinking that is it possible that some of the things that we actually see in terms of whether some gut diseases, autoimmune diseases, things of that nature, could be related to the wide exposure to glyphosate to everything that we eat. It's pretty much everywhere. So I think it's fair to ask that question. I did not do a lot of research in that area myself, but I was very intrigued and I continue to read about it because it's certainly very important just by virtue of the fact of how you actually are seeing this, right? I mean, you're spraying it everywhere. And Zach has done a lot of work, obviously, on that. And I think his work is very commendable, and I'm very familiar with him and his work. So I am open to the investigation of what other health effects glyphosate could have beyond cancer, simply because it is widely used, it is in the diet, and I think it's a fair question to ask. But it was not the area that I obviously focused on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, over at AllisonMoore.locals.com, where you can join my editorial board for $5 a month and put questions in ahead of time for interviews. To this point, I thought this was interesting. Critical Thought put a lot in here about this and mentions how glyphosate is now not only used as an herbicide, but as a desiccant. So they're spraying it. I learned about this when I was an environmental reporter in Seattle and I was covering some agriculture, that, it's basically sprayed right before they harvest. And so it's still there. He's saying one study found more glyphosate in Cheerios than the fortified nutrients they add back to the nutrient-free industrial wheat products that is the basis of this highly processed frankenfood. One of the main reasons that GMO food products are needed, in quotes, is to design glyphosate resistant strains of crops to survive the ever increasing concentrations of glyphosate required to kill the increasingly glyphosate resistant weed varieties, as you were bringing up. But I think that, yeah, so here, this is about the desiccant. Prior to harvest, to ensure the crop is dry enough to prevent mold and or rot in the siloed storage, means that unlike when it was first used by Big Ag for weed control at the start of the season, it is now also used just before harvest. So there's little time for it to disappear, therefore becomes just another constituent of our highly processed food chain. And I had learned about that too when I was in the news business. One thing I'm curious about, since this brings up, the fact that personally, I think that this topic is not covered as much as it should be. I have a personal bias towards this. I think it's an interesting topic. I like learning about this stuff, but I'm curious what you think. Do you think that the media gets it relatively right or relatively wrong? Do you think there's enough coverage of this based on the level of concern you have for it? I'm just curious your thoughts on the media, and talk a little bit about the coverage of the trials. I try to get my boss to send me down for a couple of the lawsuits, and it just wasn't in the budget. But I was a local news reporter, not national. But I thought the national stations would probably pick up our reporting because there were so few people that were actually in the courtrooms covering it. What do you think about the media related to this?
I think in 2018, when the first trial went to court, there was a lot of coverage on it. It was big at the time. In the summer of 2018, Johnson versus Monsanto was the first trial ever that goes to court in front of a jury against Monsanto specifically for Roundup. There was a lot of coverage for this in 2018 for the trial itself, especially that this was the same year where Bayer was closing the deal of acquiring Monsanto. The conversation between Monsanto and Bayer started in 2016, and the deal closed in 2018 in the summer or fall. But there was a lot happening at the time, and there was a lot of media coverage. But the media coverage was focused a little bit more on the fact that this is, what's the business impact of this, the share prices, what's happened, like I told you, how the Wall Street Journal was covering this. There was a little less on the science. Obviously, when you cover that story, you have to say, what's the dispute about? What is being litigated? What is each side trying to say? But there wasn't a lot of coverage as to the impact of glyphosate, going back to the history and the data. But I think in 2018 and the beginning of 2019, there was a lot of coverage to these lawsuits. I recall there was so much happening, especially with the second trial, also Hardeman. Hardeman was the first federal trial. That goes into court. And by the way, the Hardeman trial was the one that Monsanto and Bayer appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to hear it. But now it's almost old news, frankly. There's big settlement that took place with 100,000 people that settled. There was some lawsuits that Monsanto won, and I can describe to you why, because I think they became more strategic into which trials they take to court, which cases they take to court. So they kind of, it's not like the news of today. But I do think that, part of the reason I wrote the book and part of the reason I'm coming on various shows is because I don't think we can let this die. This is very important, and it is critical for people to know what's going on. So hopefully, we continue to raise awareness. I think the media could do a better job in keeping this in the headlines, in the news. It is very important when you look at the magnitude of what this could actually impact. I would say I was pleased with the coverage in 2018, 2019, but I think since then things have really slowed down. Maybe part of it is COVID took over for a couple of years and things of that nature, but I do think shows like yours and your advocacy and that of others hopefully could actually lead to more renewed interest in the cases and in the trials.
And thanks for bringing up your book. So everybody can read about the trials and your thoughts on this. Toxic Exposure, the true story behind the Monsanto trials and the search for justice. And you have another book coming out in a year, right?
Yes. So this book is, there's actually a funny, I don't know if you want to go into why I wrote the book, but we can if you want later on.
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
I mean, there was one in the Hardeman trial, there's something called the Daubert hearing. The Daubert hearing is basically a hearing not in front of a jury, it's in front of a judge. And basically the judge is deciding on your methodology, which means, did you apply proper methods as an expert witness to reach your conclusion, or do you just like bring this up from thin air? And in the Daubert hearing, I was being cross-examined by the Monsanto lawyers, and he looks at me and he says, well, Dr. Nabhan, I don't really see you going and lecturing all around the world and talking about the bad thing about glyphosate and Roundup. And maybe I was naive. I told them I didn't think I could do that because I'm like a testifying expert witness. I didn't think it was within the limits of the law. He said, no, you can do that. I'm like, okay, then I will. And the way I decided to do this is by writing a book, because I did not want to write a book for medical professionals or for lawyers. This is a book written for all of us, for the public. It's a story. I'm telling the story of how everything happened, including what happened to me in terms of how I reached that conclusion. So one of the things that I've learned, though, Allison, during these trials is the importance of explaining things to the jury in a very simple manner. And I always did that in my clinic. When you are a patient and you're coming to see the oncologist, you're not coming to hear a lecture about cancer and about therapy. You're trying to establish partnership with someone who really cares and with someone you can access and reach and ask questions, but you also get simplified answers. And I learned the importance of this, not just from my clinic, but also in the trials, because I had to explain to the jury a complex topic that they may not be very well familiar with. And that is really why I decided to write another book called Demystifying Cancer. I wanted to write a book about cancer, about helping patients, families, folks who are affected with cancer, and anyone who is not a cancer specialist understand the journey from A to Z, but in a very simple manner. So I used the stories that happened in my clinic, my relationship with patients, all of these things to illustrate how we can actually demystify cancer. And this is coming out in 2024.
What was the most surprising part about being an expert witness in these trials and seeing how this played out in the courtroom? And I ask because I have a lot of people on who I think are very disenchanted with the judicial system right now, feeling like it's stacked towards the government or powerful special interests, and then it's getting harder and harder as sort of like the little guy, I guess, to have justice. Can you talk a little bit, I guess, just about your thoughts on what the trials were like, and anything, I guess, that surprised you?
Yeah. I'll have to say there's a reason why there are lobbyists in Washington, right, Allison? I mean, obviously these folks get paid millions, and they pay millions because it works. So yes, unfortunately, politicians on both sides of the aisle could have conflict of interest and different allegiances, and lobbyists are able to use money and power to steer the agenda their way, no question. But I have to tell you, maybe there are two things that surprised me, and maybe the naive citizen in me did not know these things and got to know them. One, I was really assuming that the jury is going to see all of the evidence, that whatever is being discovered on both sides, you just show this all to the jury, explain that, and let them make a decision so you could reach the verdict, the sound verdict. But that's not what happens in the courtroom. What happens in the courtroom is both sides, the plaintiff, want to show evidence that's going to help their case, and the defense want to deprive the jury from seeing the evidence that might hurt their case. So you've got what we call two sides trying to lobby the judge and convince the judge what should be permissible or admitted into evidence. So the jury does not see everything. The jury sees what the judge allows them to see. And I was literally surprised at how much energy both sides exert. I mean, I understand why, right? I mean, you're the plaintiff, so you want to win the case. You're the defense, you want to defend the case and win the case. So I can understand the strategy of you want to really have the jury only see what's going to help you. But at the same time, there's a citizen in me, and I'm thinking, is this really the right thing to do? I mean, don't you really want to get the best, honest, proper verdict for any case? And to do this, show them everything. Show the jury who's going to make that verdict everything. That's really not what happens.
Hmm.
And the second thing that at least surprised me is I did not realize how big this was going to be. I admitted in the book I was very nervous. I did not realize that this is going to be huge. It was just big. It was so big that it was all over the newspapers and magazines, as you know, back in 2018, 2019. And it's intimidating because Monsanto's lawyers are the best lawyers in the country, and it's very difficult to it's intimidating to be in front of these folks because you just never know the type of questions they're going to ask and how they're going to try to trick you to say things that might hurt you as a witness in the courtroom and help them as the defense.
Okay, a couple questions more from locals, so let's do that real fast before you go. Okay, from Stoop Dog, Dr. Nabhan, the fact that Monsanto and Bill Gates have teamed up to save all the seeds in the world and store them in a cave on a remote island, and both of them have shown complete disregard for people's health, and Gates wants to cut the world population in half and is the largest farmland holder in the country and funded the mRNA gene therapy that is turning out to be toxic to lots of people, has me thinking this college dropout who is somehow regarded as a health expert is beyond the Dr. Evil character portrayed by Mike Myers. Am I being neurotic, or do you think we have a lot to worry about? How do we stop this psychopath? There you go.
I mean,
Not just a loaded question. But
I'm no fan of Bill Gates. I think his allegiances, what he has done is, with the GMOs and everything with Monsanto, obviously speaks volumes to what he's thinking. But he's a billionaire. He has a lot of money, and I think the only way to do this is to continue advocacy. I mean, you just need to continue advocacy, and we need to raise voices, and we need to let people know about these things. I don't know how else you combat someone as powerful as him and what the agenda is. So it is disappointing. It is disappointing, but I think the solution is advocacy, is writing letters, writing notes, letting people know, and it's a marathon. It's not sprint. It just takes time, but perseverance is very important. And I hope that with time, we'll be able to show the EPA and other regulatory agencies that this is just not healthy. And let's have other ways of achieving the goals we want to achieve without hurting people.
Okay. I have to recommend, since we're talking about this, I saw a great movie. I don't know why. Oh, I put us in a different format. Here we go. I'm like, why are we at the bottom of the screen? I saw a great movie on my flight back from Portland, Oregon. It's called The Biggest Little Farm. It's a documentary shot and edited and told by the farmers themselves. This couple that used to live in LA. The wife was a chef. The husband was a wildlife photographer. And they decided to leave LA, and they bought 200 acres with the help of a bunch of people who were helping fund them because they wanted to do the whole regenerative farming model. And it is just a really inspiring story. I highly recommend it. They're not a sponsor. I just saw it. It's really good. Have you heard of it?
I have not seen it.
You got to check it out. It's so good. The Biggest Little Farm. Everybody go watch it. I'm going to try to get them on the podcast. I think they'd be great guests. But yeah, it's really inspiring. I mean, they basically took just 200 acres of completely dead land, just like, soil that you could take clumps of and just bash on the ground like rocks. It grew nothing. And they turned it into a real complex ecosystem with all kinds of animals. And they document all the challenges, like dealing with the pests, the coyotes, the snails, the aphids, and how they dealt with all of that without pulling out things like Roundup. And it was really interesting. So yeah, go check it out if you're interested in that topic. Okay, Don's wife, over a decade ago, I saw a documentary warning against the evil of Monsanto. The title was something like The World According to Monsanto. It doesn't seem like that warning has done much to stop the evil that Monsanto was and still is perpetuating. Now we have a focus on the evil that another big company, Pfizer, is perpetuating. Can anything be done to stop the evil being done by these and many other big companies?
Look, I mean, I think I'll step back and say we can't assume that every company is evil. I don't think it's fair. I do think, as a cancer specialist, as somebody who has taken care of a lot of people with cancer and who have been cured with cancer, I did use many of the drugs and the chemotherapies and the agents that have been manufactured by these pharmaceutical companies that have done well, and obviously they profited from that. But certainly we could not. There are many patients that benefit from this. Now, this does not absolve any company from the fact that sometimes they need to also be scrutinized and be subject to due diligence, and we should ask them questions. Just because you do good in one arena does not mean you're going to do good in every arena. So I think it's a fair question to say that any company, if we have questions about their conduct, their behavior, we should have a system by which we're able to demand answers to our questions. And that system is not really perfect, unfortunately. But at least, before 2018 and before these lawsuits started, I think a lot of people were not aware even of the risks with glyphosate. You were, because you're obviously, this is an area of interest, but I think for the common person, it wasn't really something that was ubiquitously known. So I think there's probably a way to do this, but that way has not been clear and is not always full with bumps. But I don't, I think it is about demanding answers the legal way, and having advocates from the medical system, the legal system, and being able to lobby for being your own advocate. I mean, honestly, we need to empower patients, families, and ourselves in asking these questions, and we could do better. Our governments could do better, for sure.
Okay, Brisbane asks, while some are 100% convinced that Roundup causes cancer, I believe the bottles are labeled as may cause cancer. I think you were saying they aren't labeled that way at all.
I have not.
Okay. So I'll skip that. Was it proven to cause cancer in the case of the garden, or was it more of an emotional vote by the jury? It's been said that Roundup, once dry, is an inert dust. Is that true or false? Is this a chemical that can be used with proper precautions? And last, is Roundup an easy target for Greta-type environmental groups that dislike any large corporation? Disclaimer, these are just questions, not a defense of Monsanto.
No, and I appreciate that. We should be able to ask questions. I think on both sides, if you refuse to answer, if you say, these questions are not logical, I'm not going to answer them, you lose the argument. If you're unable to take questions and answer them, then you don't have, you must answer all questions. So, and these are good ones. So you have to step back and understand what happens. So Roundup, the main ingredient of Roundup is glyphosate. Glyphosate is a chemical. And what it does, there's enough evidence out there that it could cause breakage in the DNA. It could damage the cell, and the cells are unable to repair themselves when they're exposed to glyphosate. Now, this does not mean that this happens for everybody. You just have to remember that. It's when you say a compound is a probable human carcinogen, you are not saying that every cancer under the sun is going to be caused by this, and you're not saying that everybody who uses it is going to develop cancer. You're just saying that this is bad for you, so we don't think it's actually healthy. We don't think it's going to help, and if you must and absolutely be stubborn and you want to use it, you need to know the risks, and this is how you could possibly use it safely. As I said before, you could think of many other examples. When I would tell my patient to stop smoking, they tell me my grandpa smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day and they lived till 100. And that happens in some people. But this doesn't mean that smoking is good for you. It just means that some people, for whatever reason, they did not get cancer despite heavy smoking. So we need to understand that. So glyphosate, there are mechanisms by which it damages the cells. Now, it takes time to have that happen. So, for example, the level of exposure is critical. How often is it being used? For how long? Is it coming to touch with the skin? Is it being absorbed? I mean, all of these details are critical. It's almost if you ask someone, hey, do you smoke? And they say yes. Well, but that's incomplete information for you to judge whether there's a risk. How often do you smoke? How long do you smoke? How long? I mean, all of this information is critical. The same thing with glyphosate. So I don't agree that it actually is there and doesn't cause any problems. It could cause damage to the cells, and these damaged cells are not repaired, and with time, more cells get damaged, and eventually cancer develops in some patients. So it is not just because people use it and don't develop a problem with it does not make it safe. You have to look at the balance, risks versus benefits. If you take glyphosate, do you think the risks outweigh the benefit, or the benefit outweigh the risks? And I think the risks outweigh any perceived benefit of how it can help as a weed killer.
Someone in my locals live chat was saying that you can use vinegar and water to kill weeds. You can also use it to clean your house. So there you go.
That is correct. And I've actually had some of the patients that were suing Monsanto. I was very curious. I say, well, I know that you use Roundup because you knew it was very effective. What are you using now? And they tell me vinegar and water. Absolutely.
Okay. Per Peter Glidden, BSND, I think that's naturopathic doctor, book, The MD Emperor Has No Clothes. As reported in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, Volume 16, Issue 8, December 2004, pages 549 to 560, in a study entitled The Contribution of Cytotoxic Chemotherapy to 5-Year Survival in Adult Malignancies, which was based on data from randomized controlled trials published from January 1990 to January 2004, the conclusion of the authors was, are you ready for all adult onset cancers? Chemotherapy is 97% ineffective. I am glad you fight glyphosate, but why do you advocate ever giving someone something found to be toxic, chemotherapy?
Well, I need to read that paper, and I do not agree with that conclusion. If this was the conclusion of that paper, it is certainly inaccurate. Just so you know, I mean, the lymphoma as a disease is cured in about 2/3 of patients with chemotherapy. So is chemotherapy toxic? Absolutely. Does it cause side effects? Absolutely. Does anybody with their right mind want to just get chemotherapy for the heck of it? Of course not. But does chemotherapy cure some patients? Absolutely. Is there anybody in this chat that does not know Lance Armstrong? Lance Armstrong, who eventually was stripped from his medals because of doping, but basically he's a world famous cyclist. Lance Armstrong had a cancer that is spread all over, including his brain. Lance Armstrong is currently alive because he had chemotherapy and he also had radiation therapy. So not all cancers are cured by chemotherapy. Not all cancers could be controlled by chemotherapy, but many cancers are treated with chemotherapy, controlled by chemotherapy, and cured by chemotherapy. The type of question that your viewer and listener asked is an okay question. It is exactly why I wrote the second book, Demystifying Cancer, because there are these notions that chemotherapy hurts everybody. No, you have to remember why we give it, when to give it, the type of cancer, all of these things. But yeah, these are toxins. These are toxins, but somehow these toxins actually help a lot of people. And in certain cancers, they can cure a lot of people.
Are you, hang on, I'm pulling this up right now. Are you familiar with this book? This is a favorite of my father's, Love, Medicine, and Miracles by Dr. Siegel.
I am not.
It's a really interesting book. It's he was also I think he was a surgeon that did cancer surgery, like cut out tumors and stuff. And if I'm getting this right, he found that there was somebody that had like a terminal cancer that he had done surgery on, and found out the person was still alive like a year later. And he's like, "That's wow, you're supposed to be dead." So he asked what this person did, and one of the things that he found to be common, because after this person told him what he or she had changed in their life over, because they didn't do treatment, they just decided like, we're, I guess after the surgery, like, we're done. They just were like, we're just gonna just see what happens, change my diet or whatever. But one of the things they did was like totally rehauled their life to stop doing things that they genuinely, I guess, hated doing, and started investing more in relationships. Like they quit their job if they didn't like it. They started doing like planting a garden if that was something they really loved. They, in other words, basically just took out all the stuff that they were doing to perform, I guess, for society or whatever, and like simplified and got back to the basics. And anyway, he had his receptionist call all these people that he had operated on over the last like year or so to see who was still alive, and ask them, because he was like, wait a second, what's going on here? So he asked every single person, what did you do? And he found that to be one of the themes that I guess was related to all of these recoveries, were people who had stopped, I guess, suppressing their stress, were like just very high stress or emotionally, I don't know, performing kinds of people, like folks who were like always wanted to be a people pleaser and do the right thing and look good for whoever it was they were trying to perform for. And they just said, I'm done. And he wrote this book, Love, Medicine, and Miracles. I don't know. It's just one of my dad's favorites. I figured I'd tell people, if you're interested, maybe you would be too, doctor. I'm not sure. I have not read it yet, but I just remember that being one of the things that he's always talked about, and tells people about a lot, because he's really into stress. He's an orthopedic surgeon, but about 15 years ago, he got into nutrition, diet, and also how stress affects the immune system. And so he's been doing a lot of talks on that topic too. Have you ever found that to be something that your patients discuss?
Yeah, I think so. What's important, and I actually have a chapter in my book coming out next year on this, about complementary medicine. So there are a lot of things that we can do in addition to traditional medicine that help people and make them feel better, and could actually help also the healing process and just help the disease that we actually have. So there's, I mean, in everything that you actually mentioned, there's nothing really alarming that is not going to help the individual, in addition to the traditional treatment. You have to remember two things, two really, really, really important concepts. Not all cancers are the same, right? So breast cancer is not the same as colon cancer, not the same as ovarian cancer, not the same as brain cancer. Just the word cancer, it just tells you there's an imbalance between cell growth and cell death, but all cancers are different. Every cancer is different. The second thing is each cancer is usually treated differently. Some cancers are treated by surgery, others by chemotherapy, others by radiation, others by a combination. And others, believe it or not, you don't need to treat right away. You could completely monitor without any therapy whatsoever, and you may not have any problems. So we have a lot of examples actually of cancers that the best thing to do is not to do anything right now, and tell the patient, we're going to monitor and watch, come back in 4 months, and all of this. And then there's the complementary aspect that you talked about. I mean, acupuncture, nutrition, love, healing, all of these things. So we have to remember that. So oftentimes when somebody says, well, my next door neighbor had cancer and she hasn't done anything for it and she's fine 2 years later. that's great, but I need more detail to understand what type did she actually have, and in addition to the intervention that she has done, because there are cancers that you don't need to do anything for right away. That actually exists, and we don't usually need to do anything immediately. So my word of caution to everybody is not to put cancer as a category, all the diseases under one umbrella, because it's really very different. It's like when you say cars, what are cars? Piece of metal and four tires.
Mm-hmm.
But there are German cars, Japanese cars, American cars, Korean cars, and then there are different colors of the cars, different shapes of the cars. Then you have different license plates. So you can say cars, and cars are things that just take you from one place to another. Cancer is basically overgrowth of cells that don't die. Okay, we got that. But then there are different cars and different cancers, and the devil is in the details. The devil is in the details. But I certainly support all of the notions that the author is saying, that these things are good and they're important to do. Do they help by themselves get rid of the cancer? I'm not sure. I have to know more what cancer he was talking about, and maybe it's the type of cancers that probably don't necessarily needed any therapy whatsoever. So I need to know more detail.
Okay. Last couple questions. Why are some less likely to get tumors? This is back related to Roundup. So why are some less likely to get tumors from Roundup? Is it because they actively maintain their immune system? I think that was a question about when you were discussing how, okay, it doesn't necessarily cause cancer in everybody, but that doesn't mean it doesn't cause cancer. Any thoughts, or have you read anything? Have we made any headway into why some may get cancer after exposure to Roundup and others don't?
Yeah, I mean, good question. So remember that the cancer we're talking about here is specific type of cancer called non-Hodgkin lymphoma. It is not clear to me the association with other cancers. This is the cancer that I focused on. Certainly, as I said earlier in the show, I'm very concerned about the other health effects in addition to the cancer, and that is a completely different topic. But in terms of the mechanisms, so like I said, I think the difference may be the level of exposure, how long you have used the Roundup for, how much it has come to a contact with your skin, and the absorption to the skin. All of these play a factor. And then your own predisposition to developing something. So is it possible that you somehow have an inability to repair the cell damage? Because we have cell damage all the time. I mean, just by virtue of living, I mean, we live on this earth and our cells multiply. As our cells multiply and die, we have a lot of errors that could actually occur. But we're able to repair these errors. Our body is able to do that on their own. But somehow, maybe the Roundup is affecting our ability to repair the cells that get damaged from the exposure. But I would say the difference likely could be is how often you've used it, for how long, touch with the skin, wearing protective gear, and then inherent mechanisms of the individual in terms of their ability to repair certain cell damage or not.
There was a question about if you've been threatened at all since participating in these trials. Could I expand that question to, has your life changed at all, for better or worse, since being an expert witness in the Monsanto trials?
Well, I have to say, when I first agreed to do this, I was honestly scared, because you hear a lot of stories and things like that. You just never know. And I remember, for the first several months, I did not even tell my wife that I was actually doing this, because I wasn't really sure what the reaction would be. But things, I mean, I was never threatened. I think this, these trials happen all the time. I was scared, but there was no threat directly to me or anybody else. I am 100% sure that I was being watched, maybe my social media channels and everything, because then if I tweet something, if I put something on the media that might help the case of Monsanto, they want to show it to you.
Yeah.
And I actually, in the book, I describe how I discovered I was likely being watched on social media. But the short answer to the question, I was never threatened personally, no.
Okay. So I think the answer to this is no. Ask doctor if he has noticed surveillance. I don't think so.
I mean, I think I knew that my Twitter account and my social media is being watched for sure, and I describe in the book how I find this. I mean, I'll tell you the story really quick, but basically, I'm a big Patriots fan.
Oh
In fact,
no.
I know I lived in Boston for a long time.
I
Anyway,
did too, but I couldn't stand them.
I
They're like
know
the good old boys club that deflate
I
footballs. All right,
probably
we'll move on.
I probably lost all of your audience, but that's the reality. So I was being deposed in a case in a lady that was suing Monsanto, and the lawyer from Monsanto, before we go on the record in the position, just like shook my hand and said hi, blah blah blah, just making some small talks. And he was from New York, and he was a big Giants fan. So he was teasing me that the Giants stole 2 Super Bowls from the Patriots, and I was, joking around a little bit about this. But then I realized, well, how does he even know? Like, I'm just meeting him for the first time ever. I've never met him ever in my life. How would he even know that I am indeed a Patriots fan? And the only logical explanation was that he has seen my feed, my tweets, and all of that when I say that. So I knew right there and then that every single time I'm putting something out there, I'm pretty sure it is being read by folks who support Monsanto.
Hmm. Okay, one last thing. There was a question if you had ever known of Dr. Seyfried. Is that how his name? I'm looking over. This was the Dr. Seyfried and cancer control. Have you heard of him?
I have not.
I'm going to go back to, he's, I think this is him, Thomas Seyfried. And so this is from Boston College, but I think he's a diet and nutrition guy looking at ketogenic diets and yeah. Anyway, they suggested, hey, check him out.
I have, Allison, I have several podcast episodes coming out on my podcast on diet and cancer, on healthcare unfiltered, because I think it's a very important topic. I have one coming out in August and one coming out in October, talking about ketogenic diet, cholesterol, and plant-based diets, and the impact on cancer and things of that nature. I think it's a very important topic. It's critical for us to discuss, and I think it's challenging to conduct research in that. It's not easy, by the way, because how can you assure that the patients or the people are adhering to that diet?
Mm-hmm.
How do you factor other risk factors they may be exposed to at the same time? But it's a very important topic. I'm very interested in it, and I've actually taped several podcasts on it.
Cool. Well, maybe he could be on your podcast. That would be interesting
Would
too.
love to.
Okay, everybody, remember you can go check out, let's go back to your book here so that we give it one last shout out. Toxic Exposure, the true story behind the Monsanto trials and the search for justice. And also go to chadinabhan.com for the podcast, right? Are you on a bunch of other platforms too?
Yeah, on everything. Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon, everywhere. I mean, if they want to listen through the website, you go to the podcast tab and you put the arrow down and you'll get to Healthcare Unfiltered. And it's healthcare topics. Some of them you may enjoy. Some of them are, it depends on your flavor of the month.
Okay. Thank you so much for doing this. You have any final thoughts? It doesn't even have to be on this topic. You want to just get off your chest before you go?
No, I want to, first of all, Allison, I really want to thank you for giving me this platform, and thank you for being here. I want to thank everybody who actually listened, tuned in, for just being interested in this. And I think my last 2 comments is, number one, science evolves, and we need to evolve with the science. That's number one. And number 2, we must ask questions. There is no question that offends me, but we must ask questions, and we must be willing to answer these questions. And if we don't know the answer, it's okay to say we don't know. Being humble is very important. I think where physicians and researchers and public health officials lose people is this superiority complex where they're saying, we know better than you do. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So I think stay humble. And I think that's really how you gain traction and people really trust you. That is the most important thing.
Mm. Yeah, it definitely feels like we're not in the era of questions. To quote the former head of the, well, I guess was Fauci the head of the NIH or the NA? I always say it wrong. Was he the head of the NIH? I think
The
Dr.
end,
Fauci.
Doctor, he was part of I think the national ID. I mean,
Yeah, NIAID, right? Isn't that how you say it? Well,
right, right,
anyway,
right.
he was NIAID. Yeah, exactly. Director of the NIAID, which is basically the NIH. Anyway, chief medical advisor to the president. He's at Georgetown now. But yeah, I thought it was really. I mean, I think it would be nice to say unfortunate when he publicly put himself as the synonym with science. And so, if you were questioning him, you just didn't believe him, then you didn't believe science.
We got to a point where you're not allowed to ask questions.
Right. You can't even ask him on. I mean, that's the
Now,
whole
look,
my YouTube channel. I get.
we are taping this on July 4th, on Independence Day. This country was built on asking questions. How could you not ask questions? And I think we got to a point where we forgot that government officials work for us. We don't work for them, right? I mean, technically, we employ them, and that's really how it works. The government works for the people. So I think the thing that disturbed me over the past several years in general is the inability to ask questions. If you asked questions, if you dare to ask questions, you were labeled as anti-science. And I think that's really not fair. So if a patient comes to me and I'm seeing this patient and they're asking me about massage therapy and acupuncture, that's not anti-science. You're allowed to ask these questions. How could you not ask questions? And I genuinely believe people forget, and I've said that so many times, we are all patients. I mean, you're either going to be a current patient or a former patient or a future patient. You're not, I mean, I'm sorry, nobody's going to escape being in the healthcare system. And when you're in that patient shoes, you must ask questions. How could you not ask questions? Now, there's no question that is silly and there's no question that is stupid. I mean, my God, you go to buy a car and you ask the dealer 100 questions and you're buying a car that is not health related. And then you're nervous about asking the doctor 10 questions because who knows? And the same thing applies to public health officials. Public health officials must accept being asked questions. This is what they are paid to do, and they must provide answers. And if they don't know, just say, we are not sure. You know, if you tell somebody, we're not sure, but we think this is the right way to do, you gain more of these people versus saying, I know 100% this is the right thing to do. Well, no, you don't know 100%. Like, how do you know 100%? There's no 100%. Death and taxes only, right? These are 100%.
It's funny you bring that up because I have found that asking doctors questions is a great way to find out not just specifically the answer to the question, but who they are as a doctor and how they practice, and are they going to be somebody who is going to answer those questions, or just after your third one lose it, in which case you go, wow, I'm really glad you lost your temper on my third question. I'll find someone else, you're like, so
not only that, there are two things. This is a warning sign, and the other warning sign is second opinions. I have an entire chapter on second opinions in my future book, because doctors should embrace that. Mm-hmm. If your doctor feels threatened because you are asking for a second opinion, this is not the doctor for you. And you're right. If you're asking questions and your doctor loses patience, then this is not the doctor for you. You know why? Because the healthcare journey is filled with bumps. And if you're getting into a bump in your healthcare, don't you want somebody you trust by your side, who is knowledgeable, who is telling you right from wrong? At least you work together as a team. So you're really looking for a partner that's going to really take you through that journey, because unfortunately the journey of healthcare is not always filled with roses and flowers. It is sometimes filled with unfortunate events.
Okay, well, thank you for all of that, and thanks everybody for watching. Don't forget to go check out Dr. Nabhan's podcast, the book, and all that good stuff. And I hope you'll come back on sometime. I'm sure we'll have lots more questions for you. In the meantime, take care, everybody. Happy July 4th. We are going to do a live stream actually on my homesteading channel. So if you are not subscribed over there, check out Off Kurdish Living. It's in the description box. We will be live tonight for July 4th celebration on our new Florida homestead. And I will see you there. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.